Welcome to Boring History, where we slow things down and dive into the quiet but fascinating details of the past. Today, we uncover the rugged world of frontier life, exploring how mountain men built cabins from scratch and managed to survive the unforgiving wilderness. When the early mountain men first ventured into the wilderness, far removed from towns, villages, or settlements, they faced the challenge of creating shelter with nothing but their own hands, simple tools, and the natural resources that surrounded them. The wilderness was both abundant and unforgiving, offering everything needed to build, but requiring a great deal of knowledge, patience, and effort to transform raw materials into something livable. The tools they carried were precious, few in number, and often multifunctional, since every extra ounce of weight slowed travel and drained energy. The most indispensable of all was the axe, sometimes called the felling axe or broad axe, which could bring down trees, shape logs, split wood, and serve for nearly every stage of cabin construction. Without the axe, the idea of building a sturdy shelter from whole trees would have been impossible, as the steel edge cut into trunks with precision and efficiency that stone or bone tools of earlier ages could never have achieved. The mountain men often carried a hatchet as well, a smaller version of the axe, which could be tucked into a belt and used for finer chopping or quick tasks where a heavy axe would be cumbersome. It was especially useful for splitting kindling, notching small logs, or trimming bark away. Alongside the axe and hatchet, another essential tool was the adze, a kind of axe with its blade set at a right angle to the handle. The adze was not always available to every man, but when it was, it provided a way to smooth log surfaces and hollow beams. The long, curved swing of the adze could level a rough, hewn wall into something flatter, reducing drafts and making the cabin walls fit together more snugly. Saws were less common on the frontier, partly because of their fragility and the difficulty of carrying large blades over mountain trails, but some men did bring a crosscut saw or a smaller hand saw, and where saws were present, the work of cutting timbers became more efficient and less wasteful. Still, axes and wedges often substituted for sawing, splitting logs along their grain instead of cutting across it. The auger or brace and bit was another prized tool, used to bore holes into wood. These holes made it possible to pin logs together with wooden pegs, creating stronger joints without the need for nails or iron fasteners, which were rare in isolated wilderness. With a simple auger, a builder could join logs at corners, secure door frames, or assemble furniture, extending the usefulness of this single tool beyond construction and into daily living. A chisel, too, found its place in the pack, though it might seem like a luxury. The chisel allowed for carving notches, shaping wood with precision, and cutting mortises for joints. Used with a mallet or the back of an axe, the chisel could add the finer details that rough chopping could not accomplish. Knives were, of course, ever present. A good knife was as vital as food or fire, and it could be employed in trimming wood, shaping pegs, sharpening stakes, or smoothing surfaces. Some mountain men carried draw knives, a two-handled blade pulled toward the body, perfect for shaving bark or rounding poles. This tool, though less common, offered speed and control in creating smooth wooden surfaces, useful not only in cabins but in making sleds, paddles, or tools themselves. The froe was another specialized implement, a long blade set perpendicular to a handle, used with a mallet to split wood along its grain. With a froe, shingles could be split for roofing, thin boards could be made for flooring, and kindling could be easily prepared. Every tool, from axe to froe, represented not just an object of steel and wood, but a key to transforming a forest into a habitable space. As for materials, the wilderness itself dictated what was possible. Trees stood as the primary resource, and the choice of tree mattered greatly. Pine, cedar, spruce, oak, hickory, and chestnut all offered different qualities. Softwoods like pine or cedar were easier to cut, lighter to move, and more forgiving when shaping with an axe. They also resisted rot and insects better than some hardwoods, making them ideal for cabins that needed to withstand years of damp weather. Hardwoods like oak and hickory were more durable and strong, but they required more effort to fell and shape, and the weight of their logs made construction slower. Mountain men often chose the nearest stand of trees, balancing effort against longevity, though when time and energy allowed, Cedar or pine were favored for their resilience and workability. Logs became the bones of the cabin, but they needed to be stripped of bark to prevent insect infestation and rot. Bark could also be used separately, laid over roofs as an insulating layer or used to line floors before covering with soil. Smaller branches and saplings were gathered for rafters, supports, or simple furniture. Stones, too, were essential, gathered from riverbeds or dug from the ground to create foundations or chimneys. A sturdy chimney was often the difference between survival and hardship, as smoke from open fires filled cabins and made them nearly uninhabitable. Stones were stacked with mud or clay as mortar, forming a structure that could contain heat and allow smoke to escape. Clay served not only as mortar, but also as daubing between logs, filling gaps to block wind and cold. Moss, grass, and animal hair were sometimes mixed with clay to strengthen the seal, an early form of insulation created entirely from natural materials found within steps of the building site. Roofing demanded further ingenuity. Split shingles made from cedar or oak, shaped with the froe and mallet, provided overlapping layers that shed rain and snow. In some regions, bark slabs peeled from large trees were laid in layers, providing temporary cover until shingles could be made. Sod cut from grassy patches was sometimes used on roofs, heavy but insulating, creating green coverings that blended the cabin into its surroundings. The soil held moisture, but if laid properly with a slant for drainage, sod roofs lasted surprisingly well. Thatch made from grasses or reeds also found use in areas where timber was scarce, though among mountain men, surrounded by forests, wood-based roofing was more common. Flooring was another concern. Many cabins were built directly on the earth, the dirt floor beaten hard and sometimes covered with mats of grass, rushes, or bark. When time allowed, logs were split and laid flat side up, forming puncheon floors that were sturdier and cleaner. Creating these floors required extra labor, splitting heavy timbers and leveling them, but the result was worth the comfort and protection from damp ground. Windows and doors were rudimentary, often simple openings covered with animal hides, greased paper, or oiled cloth that let in dim light while keeping out drafts. Glass was rare on the frontier, too costly and fragile to carry into the mountains. Hinges and nails, if available at all, were scarce and precious, so doors were hung on wooden pegs or leather straps, and latches were carved from wood in clever designs that required no metal. Every aspect of construction demanded not only tools and materials, but also knowledge. Much of it passed along by experience or observation. The mountain men were not trained carpenters in most cases, yet necessity taught them. They watched how others built, they experimented with what held together, and they learned from failures. A poorly built cabin meant cold nights, collapsed roofs, or wasted labor, so careful attention to notching, stacking, and sealing was crucial. The most common method of joining logs was the saddle notch, where one log was carved to fit snugly over the log beneath it, locking them together and preventing rolling. The half dovetail notch was more advanced, angled to shed water and resist shifting, but it required precision with axe and chisel. Each notch had to be cut carefully, matched log to log, and adjusted until the fit was tight. Hours of labor went into each corner, all done with hand tools in the silence of the forest. The steel that made these tools possible was itself a marvel of its time. For men used to relying on what they could carry, the axe blade represented civilization's reach into the wild. It was forged by blacksmiths, carried over long distances, and kept sharp with whetstones or improvised sharpening on river rocks. A dull axe was dangerous and exhausting, while a sharp one split through timber cleanly. Many mountain men treasured their axes more than rifles, for without shelter, no amount of hunting could guarantee survival. The handle, usually of hickory or ash, sometimes needed replacing, and men learned to carve new handles from green wood, fitting the steel head tightly and securing it with wedges. The rhythm of chopping echoed through forests, steady and deliberate, each strike part of the long transformation of a tree into a wall. Materials were not only for cabins, but for the tools themselves. Wooden handles, leather sheaths, rawhide lashings, and even bone or antler served as repairs when iron parts failed. Improvisation was constant. A broken chisel might be ground into a knife, a snapped saw blade could be shortened into a new tool, and every scrap of iron was saved. In regions where trade posts existed, mountain men sometimes bartered furs for nails, hinges, or metal parts, but when cut off from such supplies, they relied entirely on the materials at hand. Animal sinew could bind, hide could cover openings, and stones could weight down roofs or serve as foundations. Nothing was wasted, every material pressed into service. Even fire played its role as a tool in cabin building. Controlled burning could hollow out logs, shape timbers, or harden wooden stakes. Charred wood resisted rot better than raw wood, so sometimes ends of posts were blackened in fire before being sunk into the earth. Fire softened resin and pitch, which were used to seal cracks or waterproof surfaces. The interplay of steel, wood, stone, clay, and fire created a vocabulary of building that mountain men spoke with their hands, their tools guiding them. The materials shaping what was possible. Life in the wilderness for the mountain men was not defined only by the shelter they could construct, but by the constant rhythm of survival, where every day brought the same quiet struggle against hunger, cold, fatigue, and the endless demands of the natural world. From the moment the first light of dawn spread across the mountains, the day was shaped by tasks that could not be ignored. Food had to be found, fires had to be kept, water had to be carried, tools had to be maintained, and every movement was tied to the basic truth that survival depended on preparation and persistence. In the stillness of the frontier, the simplest routines became matters of life and death, and the men who endured learned to make daily survival not a heroic effort, but a steady habit, repeated until it seemed ordinary, even dull. Though each detail carried weight, hunting was central to survival, for the wilderness offered little else that could sustain a man. The rifle was as constant a companion as the axe, slung across the shoulder or rested by the cabin wall, always ready for the chance of game. Deer, elk, bison, bear, and smaller creatures like rabbit or squirrel became the steady diet of those who lived far from farms and fields. Hunting required skill, but also patience, as long hours could pass in the woods before a shot was taken. Ammunition was precious, each ball and measure of powder carefully rationed, so every shot had to count. A missed animal meant wasted powder, wasted lead, wasted time. Success meant meat to roast, fat to render, hides to cure, sinew to twist into cordage, bones to use as tools. Nothing was discarded, and each kill became not just food but clothing, shelter, and trade. Traps and snares, set in quiet places along game trails, added to the supply, catching small animals without consuming powder. These simple devices, built from wood, wire, or cord, worked while the man was elsewhere, multiplying his chances of food in the endless struggle against hunger. Fishing too had its place, though less dramatic than the chase of game. A stream could provide trout, perch, or catfish, caught with hooks carried from the settlements or improvised from bone and sharpened metal. Lines were spun from horsehair, sinew, or traded cord, and poles cut fresh from saplings. Nets were woven where material allowed, though they demanded time and patience to craft. The quiet of fishing fit the rhythm of the wilderness, offering a slower, surer way to gather food when game was scarce or too wary. Gathering also formed part of survival, though it was less relied upon by mountain men than by native peoples. Still, berries, roots, nuts, and wild greens added to the diet, especially in summer, when abundance made the woods heavy with food. Knowing what could be eaten safely was vital, for one mistake with a poisonous plant could end a life far from help. Over time, men learned from experience, observation, and sometimes from the knowledge of those who had lived in the land long before them. Fire was constant, its presence the line between comfort and misery. From morning to night, a fire needed tending, fed with split logs, branches, and kindling. Its embers stirred to life when flames died down. Flint and steel were carried as precious tools, striking sparks into dry tinder of moss, bark, or charred cloth. In the absence of flint, bow drills or fire drills could be fashioned, though these demanded skill and patience. Once lit, fire was guarded, coals buried in ashes overnight to be coaxed back in the morning. Fire cooked food, warmed cabins, boiled water, dried clothes, hardened wooden stakes, and kept predators at bay. Without fire, the cold of mountain nights crept into bones, dampness ruined food, and life became nearly impossible. Gathering firewood was a daily chore, sometimes consuming hours, for a single night's blaze could devour a surprising amount of wood, and winter demanded a supply stacked high against the cabin wall. Water too was essential, yet even near streams, it required effort. Buckets carved from wood, hides sewn into carriers, or clay vessels were used to haul it, and in freezing weather, holes were cut into ice with axes. Water for drinking often needed boiling, to clear it of sickness carried by unseen sources, though many drank directly from cold streams and mountain springs. Snow could be melted, but it gave little water for its volume, so men learned to gather ice or seek running water even in the depths of winter. The act of drinking became part of daily rhythm, as much a necessity as breathing, and it was tied to the success of fire, for only flame made water truly safe, warm, and useful. Clothing was another element of survival, less obvious but equally crucial. The harsh wilderness tore at cloth, soaked it in rain, froze it in snow, and wore it thin with wind. Wool, leather, and fur became the materials of daily life. Wool held warmth even when damp, leather shed rain, fur carried the natural insulation of the animal from which it came. Shirts, trousers, and coats were patched and mended endlessly, needles threaded with sinew or cord drawn through worn seams. Moccasins were favored over boots, for they could be made from hides with relative ease, though they wore out quickly on rough ground. Hides were scraped, tanned with smoke or brains, softened with endless rubbing until pliable, then cut into garments that suited the land. The daily act of dressing was not about style, but about survival. Each layer of clothing a barrier between man and the biting cold of the wilderness night's food, fire, water, and clothing formed the core of survival. But there were countless smaller tasks that filled each day. Tools needed sharpening, for a dull blade wasted effort. Stones were used to grind edges back into shape, and strops of leather polished them to keen sharpness. Traps had to be checked, bait replaced, lines reset. Rifles needed cleaning after every use, barrels swabbed, powder flasks refilled, shot bags replenished. Skins from animals had to be stretched, dried, and worked, for each hide left too long would rot and spoil. Bones were cracked for marrow, fat rendered for tallow, which in turn was used for candles, grace, or cooking. The cabin itself required care, gaps sealed with fresh clay, roofs patched, floors leveled, chimneys cleared of soot. Each small chore, when done regularly, preserved life when neglected. It opened the door to hardship, and danger. Winter brought the greatest challenge, for the long nights and deep snows tested every skill a man possessed. Stockpiles of wood, gathered in warmer months, dwindled quickly, demanding constant replenishment. Hunting grew harder, as game moved deeper into shelter or grew thin and wary. Tracks in snow guided hunters, but the cold made waiting and stalking unbearable. Food stores of dried meat, smoked fish, and preserved fat became lifelines, and still, hunger pressed close. Snowshoes were sometimes fashioned, wide frames of bent wood strung with rawhide, to spread weight across the drifts and make travel possible. Without them, a man sank knee-deep, struggling with each step, burning energy faster than food could replace it. Cold froze water, stiffened leather, cracked wood, and made every motion slower. Daily survival became a fight against the season itself, and only those who had prepared well could endure it with relative ease. Spring brought floods, thawing ice, and the return of abundance, but it also carried sickness and exhaustion. The sudden melting filled rivers beyond their banks, cutting paths and carrying away supplies. Dampness seeped into cabins, mold grew on stored food, and the body, worn thin by winter, found itself vulnerable. Yet spring also meant fresh shoots, early berries, and the return of animals to the trails. Fishing improved as streams ran fast and clear, and energy slowly returned with the longer days. Summer offered warmth and bounty, though insects swarmed and heat drove men into shade. Mosquitoes and flies carried annoyance and disease, demanding smoke fires and coverings. Food spoiled quickly in heat, so drying and smoking became daily routines. Fall was the season of preparation, the most important of all, when men gathered, hunted, cut wood, and stored every scrap they could before the snow returned. The cycle turned, year after year, and daily survival remained the same pattern repeated in endless rhythm. Even sleep was part of survival, though it came in fits and starts, rarely deep, always half alert to the sounds of the wilderness. Wolves howled, trees cracked in the frost, winds moaned against cabin walls. Beds were made from piles of pine boughs, covered with hides or blankets, layered to soften the ground and hold warmth. Sometimes only the fire kept through the night offered comfort, its glow the only light in darkness. Men learned to wake easily, to rise quickly if danger stirred, to rest when they could, for fatigue wore down body and mind faster than any other hardship. Daily survival was not glamorous, not heroic, but relentless. It was the sum of small acts repeated, the sharpening of blades, the carrying of water, the tending of fire, the cleaning of rifles, the curing of hides, the gathering of wood, the quiet, ceaseless labor of staying alive in a land that offered no mercy and no pause. Isolation lay at the heart of wilderness life, shaping every thought, every habit, and every choice the mountain men made as they carved their existence out of forests and valleys far removed from towns or familiar company. To live in the mountains meant being surrounded by silence, a silence that could stretch for days, broken only by the cry of a hawk overhead, the crack of a branch in the undergrowth, or the distant howl of wolves echoing across ridges. This silence carried both comfort and unease, for it reminded a man that he was truly alone, with no neighbor to call upon, no family nearby, no quick hand to help if danger struck. Every problem, from a broken tool to an injured limb, had to be solved alone, and this constant awareness pressed heavily on the spirit, creating a life of both independence and deep loneliness. The challenges of isolation were not only in the lack of human company, but in the endless demand for self-reliance. A man had to know how to build, how to hunt, how to fish, how to trap, how to cook, how to mend, how to craft, and how to heal. If a roof leaked, he could not ask another to patch it. If an axe handle split, he had to fashion a new one. If fever struck, he relied on herbs or sheer endurance. The wilderness did not offer second chances, and there was no town doctor, no smithy, no storehouse, no helping hand. Isolation meant carrying knowledge in memory, skills in hand, and determination in heart, for forgetting even a small detail could mean hardship that stretched into suffering. Communication with the outside world was rare and uncertain. A man might go weeks, months, or even years without hearing news from beyond the mountains. Letters, when they came at all, traveled slowly through traders or other travelers, often arriving long after events had already changed. The sense of being cut off from time itself was common, as though life in the wilderness existed in a separate world, one where the flow of days was measured only by the seasons and the cycle of survival. Without regular human contact, speech itself could become strained, voices sounding foreign when finally heard after long silence. Solitude tested the mind as much as the body, and many found themselves speaking aloud to animals, to the fire, or simply to the empty air, a habit born from the deep need for conversation that had no outlet. Danger was constant, and in isolation it grew heavier. Injuries that would be minor in a town could turn fatal in the mountains. A cut from an axe might fester without proper care. A fall from a ridge could leave a man stranded. A broken leg might mean the slow passage of days without food or fire. Illness, too, carried dread, for fevers burned unchecked, infections spread, and there were no medicines beyond what nature offered. Knowledge of herbs, roots, and teas became part of daily wisdom, but even so, healing was uncertain. Death was never far, and isolation magnified its shadow, for a single mistake, a moment of carelessness, could bring consequences with no rescue near at hand. The wilderness itself challenged every sense. Storms swept suddenly across peaks, winds rattled cabins, snow buried paths, and rivers rose without warning. Each event had to be faced alone, requiring quick decisions and endless labor. If a roof collapsed under snow, the man who lived there dug it out with his own hands. If a river swept away a store of food, he faced hunger without complaint, for there was no one else to turn to. Fire that grew wild could consume all a man had built, and it was his own strength and speed alone that determined survival. These constant challenges built resilience, but they also weighed down the mind, for there was no relief, no day of rest where another could share the burden. Isolation brought with it the challenge of fear, a quiet, lingering fear that could grow in the mind during long nights, when the fire burned low and shadows moved in the corners of the cabin. The howl of wolves, the crack of branches, the rush of wind could all sound like threats, and without companions to reassure or divide the watch, fear pressed heavily. Some men grew accustomed to it, their nerves hardening, their minds settling into calm acceptance. Others found it more difficult, their thoughts circling endlessly, magnifying small sounds into dangers and dangers into terrors. The wilderness was vast and indifferent, and the knowledge that no one would hear a cry for help pressed silently into the heart. Winter deepened isolation, cutting off paths, burying trails, and silencing the land. Snow narrowed the world to the walls of the cabin and the circle of cleared ground around it. Days passed in routine, firewood carried, meals prepared, repairs made, but the mind strained against the confinement. Books were rare, paper scarce, so reading or writing offered little relief. Some carved wood, some repaired tools, some simply slept more, but the slow turning of winter nights tested the endurance of solitude more than any other season. Spring lifted the weight, but each year it returned, reminding men that the wilderness demanded not only strength of body, but also strength of spirit. Wild animals were both a source of sustenance and a source of danger, and isolation made the balance between the two more precarious. Bears, when roused, could tear through stores, and wolves prowled near cabins in lean winters. A single man could not always drive them off easily, and precautions had to be constant. Food was hung high, cabins built stout, weapons kept close. Yet animals also provided hides, meat, and fat, and the man alone had to strike the balance between predator and prey. The challenge lay not only in the hunt, but in the defense, for to be alone in the wilderness was to stand against all its forces without aid. The mind itself faced the challenge of solitude, for too many quiet hours could turn into reflection that weighed heavily. Memories of family, of settlements, of old friends, returned in the long silence, and with no one to share them, they grew sharper. Loneliness pressed hardest on those who had known companionship before, for the memory of voices, laughter, and warmth stood in stark contrast to the cold quiet of the cabin. Some men sang to themselves, some whittled, some walked endlessly, pacing paths through the woods or along rivers simply to move, to break the stillness. Isolation did not always crush, but it always shaped, leaving its mark on those who endured it, carving patience, independence, and sometimes melancholy into their character. Trade and travel offered rare chances to break isolation, when rendezvous or posts brought men together to exchange furs, goods, and news. For a brief time, the silence of the wilderness gave way to voices, to laughter, to stories shared by fire. Goods were exchanged, powder replenished, knives sharpened, cloth and tobacco traded, and for a few days the burden of solitude lifted. Yet the return to the cabin, to the quiet of the mountains, always followed. Some men found these brief reunions enough, storing the warmth of human contact in memory to carry them through months ahead. Others longed for more and struggled when the silence returned, but still they lived on, tied to the land and its demands. The wilderness demanded adaptability, and isolation was part of that demand. Every man found his own ways to face it. Some kept journals, marking each day with words that might never be read by another, yet brought comfort in the act of writing. Some created small rituals, sharpening blades at the same time each day, cutting wood to a set rhythm, preparing food with deliberate care, not because it changed the outcome, but because routine steadied the mind. Some spoke aloud to the fire, to the trees, even to absent friends, keeping the habit of speech alive. The challenge was never fully conquered, for isolation remained, but the ways of enduring it became as much a survival skill as the use of an axe or the building of a fire. The legacy of frontier resilience is not written only in the cabins that once stood along forest edges or in the trails worn through mountain passes, but in the habits, values, and quiet endurance of those who faced the wilderness with little more than their hands, their tools, and their determination. To understand this legacy, one must see how each moment of hardship, each day of survival, left marks that carried forward, shaping families, communities, and even the broader culture that grew from such beginnings. Resilience in the frontier was not a grand display of strength, but a steady persistence, the ability to rise each morning to the same demanding tasks, to endure storms, hunger, isolation, and danger without yielding, and to find within that endurance a kind of rhythm that could be passed on. The resilience of the mountain men and settlers came first from necessity, for the wilderness offered no choice but to endure. Yet over time, what began as survival became identity. Children born into cabins grew with the knowledge that work was constant, that food was never certain, that warmth required labor, that safety demanded vigilance. The lessons of hardship were absorbed before they could be explained, taken in through the sight of parents chopping wood, smoking meat, mending hides, and patching roofs. This transmission of quiet endurance, from one generation to the next, created a culture where resilience was not celebrated but assumed, not an exception but an expectation. The very idea of what it meant to live was bound up with the act of enduring. The physical remnants of this legacy could be seen in the cabins themselves, many of which stood long after their builders had gone. Rough-hewn logs darkened by weather, moss filling gaps, stone chimneys leaning but still upright, floors worn smooth by footsteps, these structures testified to the persistence of their makers. Unlike houses in towns, built with sawed lumber and finished surfaces, frontier cabins bore the direct marks of hands and tools, each notch, cut, and peg speaking to effort and endurance. To step inside one was to feel the memory of labor, the rhythm of axes, the press of need that shaped every detail. These cabins stood as more than shelters. They became symbols of human ability to carve out existence in places where nature resisted every intrusion. But the legacy reached beyond structures into the habits of work and thought that carried into later generations. The emphasis on self-reliance, on making do with what was available, on repairing instead of discarding, persisted long after the frontier itself faded. Families kept the memory of ancestors who survived winters on dried meat and thin firewood, who patched clothing until it could no longer be patched, who found a way to endure when resources failed. These stories, passed along quietly, became lessons of resilience, shaping attitudes toward hardship. Even in times of relative abundance, the memory of scarcity guided choices, encouraging thrift, caution, and preparation. The resilience of the frontier lived on in these habits, long after the cabins had rotted away. Communities that eventually formed in the wilderness were built on the resilience first learned in isolation. Neighbors who settled miles apart still understood that survival was stronger when shared, and yet the foundation of that sharing came from individuals who already knew how to endure alone. The legacy of resilience meant that communities valued cooperation not out of weakness, but out of recognition that even the strongest needed allies when storms came or illness struck. Barn raisings, harvest gatherings, and collective hunts reflected this balance, a blending of independence with interdependence, each informed by the hardships faced in solitude. The ability to endure became the root of the ability to build together, for only those who had proven their resilience in isolation could contribute fully to the resilience of the group. The frontier also left a legacy in the relationship between humans and the land. The men who endured the wilderness learned to see nature not as enemy alone, but as partner, offering both challenge and sustenance. Trees became cabins, rivers became paths, animals became food and clothing, and yet respect for these resources was embedded in the rhythm of survival. Waste was rare, for nothing could be spared. Every hide was used, every scrap of wood shaped, every ember preserved. This respect for resourcefulness, born of necessity, carried forward into a tradition of conservation, though it was not spoken of in those terms. It was simply the knowledge that survival demanded care, that to take too much or waste too often was to risk the future. The legacy of resilience was therefore also a legacy of balance, the unspoken recognition that endurance required living with the land, rather than against it. Stories of frontier resilience traveled far, carried in journals, letters, and later in tales told by descendants. Some were plain, recounting the daily tasks of survival, while others grew into legends, enlarging hardship into heroism. But beneath both plain accounts and embellished stories lay the same truth: resilience defined the life of those who went before. The legends of mountain men braving storms, fighting off wild beasts, or surviving on little more than determination captured imaginations. But they were rooted in countless smaller moments: the lighting of a fire in wet weather, the carrying of water through deep snow, the mending of a roof under icy rain. These stories, whether simple or grand, carried the memory of resilience forward, shaping how later generations viewed the frontier, and those who endured it. Even the broader identity of entire regions was shaped by this legacy. The idea of rugged individualism, often associated with frontier life, rested on the foundation of resilience. To survive alone in the wilderness, to carve out a living far from others, to face danger without flinching, these became qualities admired and idealized. Whether or not every mountain man truly lived up to the image mattered less. than the persistence of the ideal, passed down as a guiding vision of what it meant to be strong, resourceful, and enduring. The legacy of resilience thus became part of cultural memory, influencing not only how the past was remembered, but how the future was shaped. Artifacts of frontier life preserved in museums or collections also reflect this legacy. Tools worn smooth from years of use, rifles patched and repaired, clothing stitched and re-stitched, cooking pots blackened by countless fires, all speak to resilience not in grand gestures, but in daily endurance. Each object carries the weight of necessity, the silent testimony of hands that refused to yield. To study these artifacts is to glimpse the persistence of those who once depended on them, and through them, to feel the continuity of resilience across time. They are reminders that what endured was not only the people, but the spirit of survival they embodied. The land itself bears the marks of this resilience. Trails first cut by solitary men became paths for many, rivers once crossed with caution became routes of trade, clearings where cabins stood grew into towns. Each transformation began with resilience, with individuals enduring long enough to open the way for others. The wilderness did not yield easily, but through persistence, it was entered, settled, and eventually woven into the fabric of broader society. The resilience of the frontier thus became the seed of expansion, its legacy written into the very map as settlements spread. Guided by the paths first walked by those who had learned to endure alone, the psychological legacy of frontier resilience persisted too, for the habits of mind forged in solitude and hardship left marks on character. Patience, caution, and determination became valued traits, admired in leaders and ordinary people alike. The knowledge that difficulties could be endured, that hardships could be faced without surrender, formed a quiet confidence that filtered into many aspects of life. This confidence did not erase struggle, but it provided a foundation for meeting it. The legacy was not only in what was built or where settlements spread, but in the inner strength carried by those who remembered the frontier, whether directly or through the stories of those before them generations later, when life grew easier. When towns grew into cities and technology softened hardship, the memory of frontier resilience remained as a reminder of what had been required. Families told stories of ancestors who endured winters with little food, who walked miles through snow to find water, who built with bare hands what others now took for granted. These stories became part of identity, offering lessons in endurance, even when the immediate need for such resilience had faded. They served as quiet anchors, reminding people that beneath the comforts of the present lay a history of struggle and persistence that had allowed those comforts to exist at all. The legacy of frontier resilience reached into language as well, shaping phrases and expressions that carried meaning beyond their origin. To chop wood, to carry water, to keep the fire. These became metaphors for persistence in all areas of life. The plain acts of survival were elevated into symbols of determination, their memory woven into speech, into idioms, into the way people described endurance. Even when removed from their literal context, they carried the weight of the frontier, a reminder that resilience was not abstract but rooted in daily acts repeated, without complaint. As time passed, the direct experience of frontier hardship receded, but its legacy lingered in the values held by those who traced their roots to it. The respect for labor, the admiration for endurance, the emphasis on making do, the belief in self-reliance, all of these were the fruits of frontier resilience. They shaped how communities approached work, how families raised children, how individuals understood their place in the world. The wilderness might have receded, but the resilience it demanded left an enduring mark, subtle yet powerful, guiding lives long after the cabins had crumbled and the trails had turned to roads.